The religious imagination of ancient Egypt stretches back into prehistory, evolving in tandem with the rise of civilization along the Nile. Long before they put names to the famous deities of later eras, early Egyptians grappled with abstract forces of creation and the mysteries of life and death. By examining burials, artifacts, and later texts, we can trace a narrative from a primordial, formless creator concept to a rich pantheon of named gods by the Old Kingdom, circa 2700 BCE. This journey unfolds chronologically, from the hazy spiritual ideas of the pre-dynastic era, before 5000 BCE, and through the named gods of the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, 4000 to 3000 BCE, to the emergence of the first supreme creator deities in the early dynastic and Old Kingdom, from around 3000 to 2700 BCE. And along the way, these developments were deeply intertwined with social unification and the ideology of kingship, laying the groundwork for later Egyptian mythologies and religion. And keep your eye out for a more esoteric aspect to this. There's something that may not even have been consciously done by the priests and religious leaders, but what do you think would pop up in the mind of the leaders, the traveling merchants and priests who went from city to city or nome to nome and had relationships with people from far-off regions? Imagine how the kings and pharaohs, the religious leaders and traders, the people that are moving across borders, would start to think about religion and the concepts of God when each city they go to starts saying that they have the connection to the true creator of the entire universe. You'll see this power creep in the gods' powers and a rivalry between different cults. That's something that the people who lived in those villages might not be aware of, but those more informed and more traveled would know that just a gnome over was making the same claims about their god. But let's start off at the beginning, the primordial concept before 5000 BCE. In the earliest eras of Egyptian prehistory, religious thought left few direct records, yet archaeological clues hinted a belief in unseen powers. Burials from as early as the Badarian period, circa 5000 BCE, showed bodies that were buried with food and goods, suggesting a belief that life continued after death. The dead were placed in fetal position in shallow graves, often facing west, the direction of the setting sun, implying an early notion of rebirth or a journey to the afterlife. Such careful burial practices indicates that even before formal deities were named, the people had abstract notions of a life force or soul and the need to give it provisions beyond the grave. This intimate concern with death and renewal would become a cornerstone of Egyptian religion. And I gotta bring up one of my favorite Joseph Campbell quotes. As we've seen in videos now from Anatolia and into Egypt, there's the same theme of burying them in the fetal position. It reminds me of the quote from Hero with a Thousand Faces, quote, "Full circle, from the tomb of the womb to the womb of the tomb we come. An ambiguous, enigmatic incursion into a world of solid matter that is soon to melt away from us like the substance of a dream." These bodies are put back into the primordial mother, Mother Earth, in hopes that they will be reborn into a new life. But equally abstract was the prehistoric vision of creation. The Nile Valley's yearly cycle of inundation and fertility likely inspired the concept of primordial water as the source of all existence. Later Egyptian texts describe the Nun, or Nu, as the boundless waters of chaos that existed before anything else, a formless, inert void from which the first act of creation began. In these myths, Nun is the primordial substance, often called the father of the gods, encompassing limitless potential but with no defined shape. And although we have no written myths from 5000 BCE, it is telling that the Egyptians of pharaonic times believed that originally, the world arose from a dark, directionless ocean. This idea was likely rooted in pre-literate tradition, reflecting the environment of prehistoric Egypt. Surrounded by a desert, life was literally born from the fertile Nile waters each year. And so we can imagine early Egyptians contemplating an unnamed creative force akin to this yearly flood full of potential, but from which all potentiality arose. The external Nun that existed before the world, the waters, or this undulating field of potentiality. Over time, this vague creative principle would be personified and woven into coherent cosmologies, but in the beginning it remained an unformed sacred presence. The tradition from an unnamed, formless creator to named creator gods was underway, setting the stage for the emergence of distinct deities in the millennia to follow. By the late 5th millennium BCE, as Neolithic communities grew in complexity, the groundwork was laid for the first gods to take shape out of this primordial backdrop. The first named deities, 4000 to 3000 BCE, pre-dynastic to early dynastic. As regional cultures flourished in the Nile Valley during the pre-dynastic period, 4400 to 3100 BCE, Egyptians began to identify specific gods associated with natural and social forces. By the late 4th millennium BCE, we find these deities depicted in art and early writing, each centered in particular locales. Among the oldest named gods is Horus, the falcon deity, Horus personified the sky. His eyes were later said to be the sun and moon, and was especially revered at Heracleopolis, or as the Kemites called it, Nekhen, the pre-dynastic capital of Upper Egypt. Later traditions remembered the pre-dynastic rulers as the followers of Horus, suggesting that even before Egypt's unification, local chieftains legitimized themselves through this falcon god. On the famous Narmer palette from 3100 BCE, which commemorates the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, King Narmer is accompanied by Horus. The falcon is shown presenting Narmer with a symbolic papyrus marsh, which is the Nile Delta, effectively giving the king dominion over Lower Egypt. Because remember, to our directions it's flipped. Lower Egypt is in the north, and Upper Egypt is in the south. This early iconography illustrates Horus's role as a divine patron of kingship, and a unifier of the two lands. And once Egypt was unified, Horus became the tutelary deity of the entire populace and its kings, becoming symbolic of the authority of the pharaoh. Every king of the early dynastic period took a Horus name, reinforcing the idea that the pharaoh was a living manifestation of Horus on earth. In these first dynasties, Horus was typically depicted as a falcon perched atop the royal Serach, which was a palace facade symbol, and it was watching over the king's name, showing that he was giving his support to the pharaoh and acting as protector. And so Horus emerged from pre-dynastic times as a sky god and falcon of war. Counterpart to Horus in many ways was Seth, or Set, another god whose worship dates back to pre-dynastic times. Set was portrayed as a mysterious composite animal, often described as a red-haired beast with a forked tail and distinctive muzzle, seemingly not based directly on any real animals we know about. And he embodied the wild and often hostile forces of nature, like storms, deserts, and just chaos in general. Early evidence of Set appears in the Nakata culture of Upper Egypt. The town of Nakata was ancient Nupt, or Gold Town, and was sacred to Set. In pre-dynastic art and pottery, symbols of the so-called Seth animal are occasionally found, and are seen as evidence of his cult. Importantly, Set was not originally an evil figure in the way that later myths would paint him. Rather, he was just a necessary and natural force, a god of the frontier, of strength and chaos, complementing the ordered kingship of Horus. It's funny and interesting that in a way these are such early stories that they're almost before what we would think of as modern morality. They're just describing the world how it is. That there's this one force that wants to order things, keep things under human control and be predictable, and that often leads to humans enjoying their life a lot more than the chaotic state of nature. But then necessarily, there will always be this other force, the way things just always were, or the natural order, which is indifferent to humans. The areas built for humans, their proto-cities obviously met the needs of humans better than the wild frontiers. And so it's sometimes hard to get it into our modern heads that they're not saying that one is ontologically good or evil, it's just more conductive to our human lives. And it's silly and useless to act like Set could never exist or be completely destroyed. Things are either actively maintained under the direction of Horus, and always under the pressure to return to the chaotic state indifferent to humans, the force of Set. And it is in this time, before the more personified stories of these two characters, that we see early royal ideology seeming to have balanced the two. One second dynastic king, Peribsen, shocked tradition by replacing the Horus falcon atop his royal Serach with the animal of Seth, effectively crowning Seth as his royal patron. This bold move suggests that by around 2700 BCE, Set's cult was powerful enough to rival Horus in state symbolism, and according to seal inscriptions from that time, Peribsen, quote, broke with tradition and adopted the god of Set as his patron instead of Horus, and this was during a period of internal strife. If this was a highly turbulent time with civil war and things seeming to go to chaos, maybe we can see this as him trying to meditate or channel or pray to Set, basically be guided by this god of chaos, saying that he was the more powerful force of this time. And it's really interesting that peace was restored by the end of Dynasty 2 when King Kasekemwi explicitly united the two. He took both Horus and Set into his royal titles, showing a reconciliation and dual patronage. And thus Set, like Horus, was deeply entwined with kingship from the earliest dynasties. He represented the raw power and unpredictability that the king had to harness. Only in later mythology would the Horus-Seth rivalry be recast as a purely moral conflict, with Horus as good and Seth as evil. In the early dynastic context, they were two sides of the same divine coin, each essential to universal balance. And I don't want to say that these two cultures are connected, but that might have evoked the imagery of the yin-yang symbol from Taoism, that it's more descriptive of reality and not moralizing. Of course, in one sense, humans never want anything to go wrong ever, and wrong just means against what we hoped, or what makes it harder to enjoy life. But in this era, where a pharaoh could take both Horus and Seth in his royal titles, it shows that at least in this highly turbulent time, he thought it best to try and understand and be in communion with these two forces. But now I want to turn to another deity rising in prominence during 4000 to 3000 BCE, Menu, the god of fertility and male generative power. It's spelt Min, and I'll put a graphic on screen here for how the pronunciation works, but most believe it would have been pronounced Menu or Minu. This cult originated in the pre-dynastic period and centered on the towns of Koptos and Akhmim in Upper Egypt. Archaeological finds at Koptos include large statues and emblems of Menu dating to the late pre-dynastic period, the so-called Koptos Colossi, which shows that there was established worship here. Menu was typically depicted in a distinct pose, standing what's called ithyphallic, with the phallus erect, with a raised right arm holding a flail. This iconography, already present in prehistoric carvings, shows his role as a god of procreation, harvest, and virility. As the patron of the eastern desert and caravans, Menu was also provoked for protection on journeys. By the start of the First Dynasty, Menu's symbols appear in royal context, and later kings would honor him in coronation ceremonies to ensure agricultural productivity. The continuity of Menu's cult from pre-dynastic farmers to pharaonic kings shows the religious significance of fertility in a land dependent on the Nile's bounty. Great festivals for Menu, which are recorded in Old Kingdom and later texts, involve public processions and offerings to celebrate his coming forth, likely tied to the arrival of the Nile flood and ensuring growth of crops. That description of his coming forth you might recognize from the actual name of what we call the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's ironic because it's not about dying, it's about living past your bodily death, and its name in the Egyptian was the Book of Coming Forth by Day. In that case, it was symbolic of the person becoming one with the sun god. Their soul, or Ba, would emerge from the tomb each day, just like the sun rises each day. But in these early periods, Menu embodied the creative, life-giving forces of nature, revered in both simple agrarian rites and at the level of state religion. From the Delta came the influential goddess Neet, another of Egypt's most ancient divinities. Neet was a war and creation goddess, often shown wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, with two crossed arrows and a shield as her emblem. She stands out as one of the earliest deities in the archaeological record, with clear evidence of her worship by the Naqada II period, around 3600 to 3350 BCE. Her main cult center in ancient times was the city of Sais in the western delta, and so this may be where she originated from. But even so, her presence was felt in Upper Egypt too. So much so that when King Narmer unified the country, he married a princess named Neet Hotep, which means Neet is satisfied, indicating the symbolic union of Lower Egyptian and Upper Egyptian religious traditions. In the early dynastic period, 3100 to 2686 BCE, Neet was the preeminent goddess, so revered that a sanctuary was dedicated to her at the national capital Memphis. And uniquely, some myths regarded Neet as a self-created deity or cosmic mother. Late inscriptions would credit her with creating the world, and called her the mother of the sun god Ra and the crocodile god Sobek. This suggests that very ancient traditions saw Neet as a primordial creatrix, a female parallel of the formless Nun. In Plutarch's work from around the 1st century AD, on Isis and Osiris, section 9, the inscriptions upon her, Isis's shrine at Sais, say, "I am all that has been and is and shall be, and no mortal has ever lifted my garment." Though Plutarch is referring to Isis here, he claims this inscription was found at the Temple of Neet in Sais, in the western Nile Delta. The Greeks commonly identified Neet with Athena, and Isis was a composite of several Egyptian goddesses, including Hathor and Neet. And so by Plutarch's time, the identities of these goddesses were blended through a long process of syncretism. I want to make a whole video on the idea of how syncretism just doesn't work. I know that might be a bit controversial since I'll be disagreeing with the people who lived at this time, but I think so much confusion is caused by Greek syncretism. I might be bringing up a bad example to harp on this, since it is interesting that there are some tales of Athena that also portray her as being self-created, but I'm not aware of any ones that have her creating the entire cosmos, or even at least this world. So many of the Greek synced gods just don't make sense. They're based on such superficial similarities sometimes. One that drives me nuts is how Hephaestus, a craftsman for gods on Olympus, who's Hera's son, is just said to be the same as Ptah, who created himself and everything out of nothingness and is in all things. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that since I brought up Plutarch's syncretism there. But back to Neet. In the context of 4000 to 3000 BCE, we see her mainly as a patroness of hunting and war, with arrows and a shield, and as a protectress of kings, and royal women in particular invoke Neet's name for legitimacy. The early prominence of Neet shows the role of goddess in pre-dynastic religion. Even in this masculine age of warrior chiefs, the concept of a primordial mother and a divine protectress was deeply valued. Her worship endured through every era, but its roots go back to these first chapters of Egyptian civilization. Another early deity bridging life and death was Wapawet, often described as a jackal or wolf on a standard. His name means opener of the ways, and he originated as the god of the upper Egyptian city of Asyut, which is in the Abydos region, but the Greeks call it Lycopolis because of the wolf symbolism, that lyco part coming from the same root as lycanthrope or the werewolf. Evidence suggests he was worshipped at Abydos even before the dynastic period, possibly predating another wolf or jackal god of that necropolis. In late pre-dynastic and early dynastic times, Abydos was the burial ground for Egypt's proto-kings, and Wapawet likely served as a guardian of royal cemeteries and a guide for the souls of the dead. In many early royal processions, a combat standard bearing Wapawet led the way, a ritual role so established that on the Narmer palette and other ceremonial artifacts, one of the processional emblems is a canine figure on a pole, identified as Wapawet's standard. This honor of going before the king in a procession earned Wapawet the title Opener of the Ways, clearing the path for army or pharaoh. By the Old Kingdom, he was known throughout Egypt, but in the formative years he was especially linked to royal power and military might. One inscription from the Sinai in the 3rd dynasty credits Wapawet with opening the way to King Sekhemkhet's victory. In his celestial aspect, Wapawet was sometimes said to run at the prow of the sun god's bark, his ship, scouting the way for Ra through the sky each day. More commonly, he was invoked at funerals to open the gates of the netherworld for the dead. The jackal-wolf deities of Egypt often overlap, and over time, Wapawet was closely linked with Anubis, the more commonly known jackal god of mummification. But the fact that Wapawet appears on some of the earliest royal insignia show that from the start, the Egyptians personified their perilous journey, whether into battle or into the afterlife, in this form of a god who makes the way safe for them. In pre-dynastic belief, as communities began to formalize rituals, Wapawet filled the need for a divine guide leading them through unknown paths. His antiquity is such that he is counted among, quote, the earliest gods to be worshipped at Abydos, and his later integration into the Osiris funerary cult did not erase his independent and formative role. By around 3000 BCE, on the eve of the Old Kingdom, Egypt's religious landscape now featured a diverse pantheon of deities like Horus, Set, Menu, Neat, and Wapawet, each with established cults and local temples. These gods had transformed the nebulous forces of the primordial age into vivid personalities with names, recognizable forms, and myths. And they also mirrored the unification of Egypt. Southern and northern deities were now worshipped side by side, and even combined in royal ideology, as seen with Horus and Set, and the idea that you would have this main protector god, while also still performing rituals and hope to be in harmony with Menu, Neat, and Wapawet. The presence of these named gods shows a major evolution in theology, the shift from unwritten, abstract ideas to concrete gods with cult followings, and specific ways that you carry out their rituals. There's a right and wrong way to do things now. Yet their evolution did not stop here. Egypt's theologians and rulers began to elevate creator gods to supreme status, reflecting both cosmic speculation, this early philosophy that tries to make sense of these things, and just the practical aspect of the political centralization of the two lands. The question arose, who among the pantheon had created the universe itself? And the many answers came in the form of the first great creator deities of the Egyptian dynastic and Old Kingdom period. The first supreme creator gods, 3000 to 2700 BCE, early dynastic to Old Kingdom. As Egypt entered the early dynastic and Old Kingdom era, religious thought coalesced around a few great creator gods who embodied the origin of the cosmos. The consolidation of the Egyptian state under pharaohs and the emergence of cities like Memphis and Heliopolis as religious intellectual centers went hand in hand with the formulation of sophisticated creation theologies. And this happened incredibly fast, because by 3000 BCE, at least 3 deities were widely revered as primordial creators. Ta at Memphis, Atum at Heliopolis, and Ra, sometimes pronounced Re, the sun god. These were not new gods. They had likely existed in local worship in earlier times. It's just that we might not have found as much archaeological evidence, but this can be inferred by how quickly they rose to national prominence. Each offered a different explanation of how the world began, and together they illustrate how Egyptian theology evolved alongside state building. Ta was the creator god of the new capital, Memphis, which tradition says was founded by the first dynastic king around 3000 BCE, with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Archaeologically, Ptah appears in the record by the start of Dynasty 1, so maybe even a whole century earlier, pushing it back to 3100 BCE, and there's good reason to believe that his worship was rooted even earlier in the north. As patron of craftsmen and architects, Ptah was envisioned as a divine artisan who crafted the cosmos. One ancient depiction calls him the sculptor of earth, who shaped the gods and all living beings as a craftsman working clay. In later texts, famously known as the Memphite Theology, which was inscribed on the Shabaka stone and is a copy of an Old Kingdom document, Ptah's mode of creation is described in strikingly intellectual terms. He creates through mind and speech. And according to this theology, Ptah first conceived the world in his heart, or his mind, and then spoke words with his tongue to bring it into existence. As one scholar summarized it, quote, "He is the creator as commander. Ptah thinks and speaks, and it is so." Highlighting that for Memphite priests, the word of Ptah was the cosmic law. The notion of a creation by divine word is remarkable, and may be the earliest recorded example of creation by thought and speech in human history. It shows an evolution from the simple, physical creation myths, like a god molding clay or birthing children, to a more abstract concept, creation as an act of mind or will and logos. Ptah was thus elevated to supreme status in Memphis theology, not only patron of artisans, but the very creator of reality itself, a god whose thoughts became material truth. It's telling that Ptah is sometimes titled Ptah-nun, Ptah acting or embodied as the primeval waters, and called Father of Atum, meaning Memphite theologians explicitly linked him to the primordial Nun, and said Ptah preceded and even created the sun god Atum. This is a bold theological statement of Memphis's primacy. In practice, Ptah's worship remained centered in Memphis. His great temple was called Hut-ka-Ptah, or Mansion of Ptah. But as the king's capital, Memphis projected Ptah's influence all across the land. And how perfectly fitting is it that we get the very name Egypt from this temple? It's from passing through so many different languages. When the Greeks visited the capital of this strange and wonderful land, they heard the name of the most grand location of their creator god's temple. Hut-ka-Ptah became Aigupto, and then when the Romans heard this, it became Latinized into the Aegyptus, and we get the earliest version of Old French via interactions with this area during the Crusades, where it is slightly transformed again to Aegyptu, which was a pretty easy jump to the English Egypt. So the t ending almost perfectly matches the ta, and it's why I'll often use Kemite and Egyptian interchangeably. While the people of this area called their land Kem, meaning the black soil, in reference to the rich earth along the Nile, and will call themselves Kemites, this is one of those times where the modern name is just not that far off. I would argue calling them Egyptians more accurately reflects what we're talking about, since we're not really trying to identify a single ethnic group, but we're talking about this whole culture or civilization, which becomes unique and starts taking shape under the unification of Narmer, with the creation of Memphis as the capital, and Ptah representing both an enormous religious and philosophical jump to see the creator god as one who brings about existence via his mind and word. So to me, it's beautiful and perfectly fitting that thousands of years later, what most people think of as the unique religious and architectural achievements of these people, that are in a way being called the people of the temple of Ptah's spirit, these Egyptians. In the Old Kingdom, pharaohs took on the titles like Beloved of Ptah, and major building projects like pyramids and temples were placed under his patronage as Lord of Craftsmen. We see here how state formation influenced theology. Just as Memphis united Egypt administratively, its god Ptah provided a unifying creation story. One nation under one creator god. By the end of the Third Dynasty, around 2700 BCE, Ptah stood among the top tier of deities, a position that he would retain throughout all pharaonic history. Meanwhile, in Heliopolis, the city of the sun in Lower Egypt, a different creation narrative was flourishing under the god Atum. Atum was worshipped in Heliopolis from around the late pre-dynastic times, but he gains prominence in sources by the Old Kingdom. The Heliopolitan theology held that in the beginning there was only Nun, the dark, limitless ocean, until Atum willed himself into being. Atum is thus a self-created god, and the word Atum in Egyptian itself means the all or the complete one, showing this totality. According to the Heliopolitan Aeneid myth, quote, Atum was considered to be the first god, having created himself, sitting on a benben, the mound, and rising from the primordial waters, Nun. In this image, we see the transition from the primordial concept to a named creator. Atum is effectively the personification of the first mound of earth that emerged from Nun's floods at the dawn of time. Once he came into existence, Atum proceeded to generate the first divine pair, Shu and Tefnut, which means air and moisture. Quote, early myths state that Atum created the sun god Shu and goddess Tefnut by spitting them out of his mouth. In other versions, and for YouTube monetization reasons, let's say that Atum plays with himself in order to bring about another kind of fluid, and the casting of this seed creates air and moisture. But either way, they're trying to address the underlying idea that Atum is creating life from himself, and is self-made without any predecessor. From Atum's first offspring would eventually come all other elements of the world, the sky, Nut, and earth, Geb, and their children, Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, thus forming the Great Aeneid in Heliopolis, 9 gods headed by Atum.
By the 9 divines!
By the Old Kingdom, around 2500 BCE, this cosmogony was firmly established as evidenced in the pyramid texts, inscriptions that were carved into the walls of royal tombs. Pharaohs of the 5th dynasty referred to Atum in their tomb prayers, and one pyramid text spell describes how Atum, in the form of a serpent, will survive alongside Osiris at the end of time, when all returns back to water. Such texts show Atum not only as the creator in the beginning, but would also be present at the end, applying his eternal nature. Atum's primary form was a man wearing the double crown of Egypt, though it also could be a serpent or mongoose, and he was especially associated with the setting sun, the sun as it returns to the horizon, symbolically going back into the womb of noon each evening. In Egyptian thought, Atum's cycle was repeated every day. Each sunset, the sun, as Atum, died or transitioned into the water of night, only to be reborn at dawn. In this sense, Atum was linked with Ra, the sun god, very early on, and texts often merged their identities as atum-ra, treating them as one being, Atum in the evening and Ra at noon. By the close of the early dynastic era, Atum's cult at Heliopolis had so much prestige that it influenced kingship rituals and royal ideology across Egypt. And we should really note that it's at Heliopolis that Kemites were provided the solar calendar and the ideology of the kings as sons of the sun. Ra, the sun god, deserves special attention as he became the dominant deity of the Old Kingdom. In the early 3rd millennium, Ra was worshipped at Heliopolis alongside Atum, and may originally have been considered simply the manifestation of Atum in the sky. Again, it's different incarnations, not different deities. Over time, though, Ra took a distinct and exalted position as the supreme solar deity. The pharaohs increasingly identified with Ra's power. By the 4th dynasty, around 2600 BCE, kings like Jedefra and Khafra incorporated Ra into their throne names. And by the 5th dynasty, around 2500 BCE, a formal title, Son of Ra, became part of the royal titulary. According to later historical tradition, the 5th dynasty kings were literally chosen by Ra. Their birth myth involves Ra visiting a priest's wife, which may reflect that dynasty's strong promotion of the solar cult. In any case, by the Mid-Old Kingdom, the cult of Ra had spread across Egypt to become the most popular and state-supported religion. But because this idea already seeped in that there would be a supreme creator god who was in all things, and self-generated from the very beginning of time and to last into the end of time and beyond, Ra has to pick that up too, and he is of course venerated as creator and supreme lord. The massive pyramids of Giza, built in the 4th dynasty from 2600 to 2500 BCE, are reflecting solar theology. Their west-east alignment in the pyramid shape, resembling the Ben, the primordial mound, as well as the symbol of the sun rays themselves, coming down in this pyramidal fashion, they're all tied to Ra's domain. Pharaohs of the 5th dynasty went further, building actual sun temples to Ra at Abu Ghurab, completed with a giant obelisk, which is itself another form of the Ben stone, and which was open to the sky for solar rituals. Ra was typically depicted as a hawk-headed man crowned with the sun disk, traveling across the sky in his solar bark by day and through the underworld at night. In the pyramid texts, kings aspired to join Ra in his boat and accompany him in the heavens. This solarization of kingship marked a theological shift. Whereas early dynastic rulers were the living Horus on earth, Old Kingdom rulers increasingly saw themselves as the sons of Ra, who would, after death, reunite with the sun. It's the pharaohs giving themselves a lower position. They are not Horus embodied on earth, but they are now secondary to the son of a god. Certainly his feared and powerful emissary, who would need to be followed absolutely, but still not actually the god Ra incarnated in the pharaoh. Whereas before, if you were talking to an early dynastic era pharaoh, you were speaking directly with Horus. But importantly, Ra's ascendancy did not abolish other creation gods, but instead syncretized with them. By the end of the Old Kingdom, priests often spoke of atum-ra, identifying the creator Atum fully with the god Ra, and even Ta-ra in certain texts, demonstrating a fusion of creator concepts. Each major cult center kept its traditions. Memphis would extol Ta, Heliopolis had atum-ra, but Egyptians tended to merge and harmonize these ideas rather than seeing them as contradictory. One theological text even claims that it was Ta who, quote, called the Aeneid into existence, implying Ta's words brought forth Atum, who then begat the Aeneid. And so we're seeing Memphis acknowledge Heliopolis myth, incorporated it into and under Ta, still seeing him as the ultimate source of everything. This syncretism was typical. As the state religion evolved, different cities' priesthoods wove their stories together. They didn't try to destroy each other's tradition, and the pharaoh would not want violence and disorder. So this act of identifying one with another, saying that two gods were the same aspects of the same deity, on a practical side it's just keeping the peace, but on the actual philosophical side, it really does seem like they're just saying these are different names for that same force. Languages all have different words for the sun, but they're talking about the same thing. If you're praising the creator of all existence, you're not offending the cult in a different city by using a different name. By 2700 BCE, this syncretism process was well underway. Ra, Atum, and Ta were not seen as rivals but complementary expressions of the creator. Together they show how the unification of Egypt and the stability of Pharaoh enabled this pluralism within unity that defined Egyptian theology. The king, as the intermediary of the gods, embodied all these, performing the rituals of Ta at Memphis, celebrating Ra at Heliopolis, and maintaining the sacred order, Ma'at, that these creator gods had established at the dawn of time. If you start a fire, you create heat and smoke. By definition, fire needs something to consume. So in the existence of fire, some things are necessary and some things are emanated. But in a sense, these four distinct things are all part of one process, one action. That to the Egyptian mind, it seems like if you said that these were separate, completely isolated things, that you don't understand what it means that Ma'at, that cosmic order or righteousness, emerged from God, the Creator. It would be like saying you think there could be fire without heat. That it's useful to have the word heat, but when a fire is burning, you have at least 5 different things that you could name, but it would also be silly to not see them all as connected in a deep way. And I think trying to think like that will help you understand how the Kemites thought about these gods, while keeping in mind that why certain stories and names were chosen, just like why it is that you speak a certain language, or think of certain stories as part of your culture, is because of the actions of states, of political entities, that were all vying to be the power in charge of your ancestors. As pharaohs centralized power, they elevated universal gods that could legitimize that power. Ta provided a divine endorsement for Memphis's rule. Ta was the capital of their empire. To the people of Egypt, the Kemites, who were just getting used to the idea that they were one big unified people. It of course had been thousands of years of different areas with their own identity. But Ta created everything and is in all things. Your local gods emanated from Ta, and Pharaoh is the blessed one of Ta. Atum-ra provided a direct link between the king and the life-giving sun. We see this in royal titles, like the 5th dynasty pharaoh Nusere, which means possessed of Ra's power. In art, the sun disk over the king's head, or the king offering Ma'at to Ra in temple reliefs. In the pyramid text, the utterance declaring the king is a star and will sit with Atum at creation. In effect, by the Old Kingdom, the Egyptians had moved from venerating local tribal gods to worshipping cosmic deities who ruled over creation itself, just as their king ruled over the unified land. The creator of everything was worshipped at his capital, and he was the son of that great life-giver, the sun floating over your head. And while no one could challenge Pharaoh, these theological centralizations did not erase the older gods from local regions. It's far from it. Horus, Set, Menu, Neith, Wepawet, and many other gods all remained important and were absorbed into the mythic family of the greater gods. Horus became identified as the son of Osiris and a form of the sun, Herakti, while Neith was later said to be the mother who bore Ra at the beginning. But the conceptual leadership of the pantheon now lay with these great creator figures, who defined the very cosmos within which the older gods operated. And remember, it is believed that Ta comes from the north, which would have been in heavy contact with other cultures, from the Libyans to Anatolian and Levantine influences coming down toward the Nile. Like I've covered in other videos, things like grain and cattle, which would also become tied to gods, take on metaphysical importance in the afterlife, and of course provide the actual calories to build these great civilizations. This technology absolutely came from the Anatolia region. So that's a really interesting, potentially darker side to this concept of syncretism. If you see it as some sort of foreign power taking over, imposing this creator god Ta on them, while trying to maintain peace and absorb them into their pantheon, but still under the creator. That's something that's really going to need a whole separate video. I hope to get that out soon.